Hello, everyone, and welcome to Beginner Breakdown. This is a show that we did a while ago and we're bringing back. I am Alex Moellering. I'm going to be your instructor for this show, and I'm happy to be here. And tonight, our theme is surveying the scene. So when I think about a chess game, one of the first questions I have, and if you're looking at a board, if you're a player or a spectator, you want to get a sense of, well, who's winning? What's going on in the game? That's where we're going to start. How do we evaluate a position? What kinds of things do we need to look out for? And that's where we're going to start tonight. So the first question I have is, why do we count material? Material, if you're not familiar, is what we name all of these different pieces. It's all material, and each of these, the pawns, the queen, the bishop, the knight, the rook, everything has a material value. The king doesn't, because it's the most important piece. If you lose the king, you lose the game. But there's a question of, well, let's start at the very beginning. Why do we count material? So in this position, it's black to move and try and come up with a plan. And there's a lot of things going on here. It might look pretty complicated. There's some interesting pawn formations we have against whites. And there's a huge climactic battle here in the center that's leaving us asking, okay, well, what on earth should we do here? And so I would say, let's just start by counting it up. So each side, okay, we have a bishop, so that cancels out. We both have a knight, that cancels out. We both have two rooks. Obviously, we both have a king. So all of the pieces cancel out. Let's just look at everything else. We have some pawns. So black has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 pawns, and white has 1, 2, 3, 4. So that means black is up in material. We're 2 pawns or 2 points up. So whenever you're up in material, a good general rule to follow is try and trade stuff down. And in this case, we actually can, and we can start this big, massive trade here in the center. I would start with the bishop, because now we're hitting the king and the bishop, and this is check. So this is forcing a response from our opponent. Most likely, they're going to take with the bishop, because if they take with the rook, we can get it for a knight, and we're winning that exchange. So after the bishop takes, again, you have an option. I would probably take with the rook, as it's the most forcing, and we're making a lot of threats. And remember, we're up in material as the black side. We want to trade pieces, and we're going to talk about why. After we trade, again, maybe we do something like this, and all the pieces get traded. If we take a look at the board now, everything is cleared out from the center, this massive trade, and now it's our turn to move. I would probably, in this position, play the move king to d5, taking opposition and restricting the space from my opponent's king. And then we can take another look at the material. It's the same as before. All of the pieces have been traded, so they're all gone, and we both have a king. But now, my 6 pawns are actually a pretty significant advantage over your 2. It's going to be a lot easier for me to sort through the chaos of what this position was and just be able to win an endgame with some pawns. I don't know exactly what my plan would be, but I'm going to have much more space and much more options. My pawns will beat my opponents on this side, even if my king doesn't. So I can use my king to just keep away, essentially, and force this king away. And it should be a pretty easy win. That's the very bottom line of why do we count material, helping us to get a sense of, well, what should I do in this position, who's winning, who has more material, and then getting some complexity and simplicity in the game. However, it's not quite that simple. We don't know who's winning a chess game just based on which pieces are on the board, because there's lots of times when people make sacrifices. There's lots of times where people win in positions where they have way less material. So we need to explore a little bit farther. How do material values change? And so if we're talking about the opening and the middle game, there's something important to note about material value. So let's just look at the sample line. We have a king's pawn game met with e5. Again, very classic chess here. Knight f3 and knight c6. Bishop comes out, so we have an Italian game and bishop c5. This is a very common idea. A lot of kind of beginner games feature this, but it's also featured at the high level. It's just very solid stuff. And we see castles, knight to f6, and now knight to g5, a little bit on the aggressive side. Normally, it would be advised for white to continue developing Maybe bring this knight out, maybe defend the pawn here on e4 that's just been attacked. Maybe bring a rook out. There's lots of options, but moving this same piece is a little questionable, and we're going to see why. But white has an important reason for doing this that's a bit problematic. After black castles, white made an interesting decision here, and they took this pawn on f7. Rook takes, bishop takes, and king takes. And white is saying, well, the material's equal, right? So why does it matter? And if we go back, when we think about the material count, if I didn't say before, most people are going to be familiar with this, but we generally think of a pawn as being worth 1 point, the knights and the bishops as being worth 3, the queen being worth 9, and then the rooks are worth 5 apiece. And again, we can't evaluate the king because it's the most important. If you lose it, you lose the game. So white's saying, okay, I have 2 pieces here, a bishop and a knight, both 3 points, so that's 6. And my opponent has this pawn and this rook, 5 and 1, that's also 6. So why shouldn't I just trade all this stuff? It's even, right? So again, counting material is a good first step, but this is actually a bit of a problem. Because if we look at this position, even though white's knight and bishop are technically worth the same as black's rook and pawn, black is a lot better in this position. What's the reason? It's piece activity. We had material on the board. We had a knight and we had a bishop, and now they're gone. And yeah, we got rid of a rook and a pawn, but what were these pieces doing? Our pieces were much more active. And so we've given up our best pieces. If you actually look at this position, all of white's remaining pieces, not the pawns, the pieces, are stuck here on the back rank. And if we look at black, well, they have a beautiful bishop. They have a knight that wants to jump in. Maybe a knight's going to come over here and assisted by the queen. Black's pieces are already developed and ready to go. So this is a really big problem. So we can't just make evaluations based on the material count, but it is a good place to start. We have to think also about why pieces are worth what they're worth. So why would we say a pawn is worth 1, or a knight is worth 3, or a bishop worth 3, or, etc.? And the reason is because of their scope and their range. So if we go back and just look at all these pieces, the pawn is worth 1 because it moves the slowest, right? At the beginning, it can move 2 spaces. After that, it can only move 1, and it only covers 2 spaces wherever it is in terms of what it's attacking. Now, if you get a pawn to the end, it promotes, and that changes the game. But until then, or until it gets closer, it's not really doing much, so it's worth 1. The knights and the bishops. If we think about these, the knights move really weird, so they're hitting a lot of space, but they have to be in certain areas, right? If we go back to our position here, after this trade is all completed, well, this knight is not nearly as good as this knight. And we can figure out why very easily. It's about how much space they're controlling. This knight can right now move to this space, and this space. So it's got 3 options. All of them are pretty much in white's territory. White already is controlling all of these spaces. Let's look at black's knight here, for instance. It's controlling 1, 2, 3, 4. You can already see it's controlling 8 spaces, and some of these are in its own territory. But all of these squares are really important at this point in the game. Same thing with the bishops, right? This bishop is actually doing nothing. It's stuck completely behind these pawns versus black's beautiful bishop is active and on a very nice line, controlling a lot of spaces. So pieces are valued differently because of their power and what they can control. The queen, because she can move in every direction, is worth 9. She has the most options as a general rule. But there are some cases where a queen could be trapped in a corner and not really doing much. So we have to keep these things in our consideration. Something else that changes how we evaluate a position is if we go back here and look. Remember, we just said, okay, well, maybe a knight and a bishop aren't worth this rook and pawn, because right now it's the opening, it's the middle game. Getting our pieces into the game is crucial. We need to have more forces protecting the center, and right now the bishop and the knight are doing that way more than this rook and pawn. However, what if we were to look at an endgame? If we had traded all these pieces off the board, and we're in a very simple endgame, you can have a king, a knight, and a bishop. This is our 6 points here, and it is possible to checkmate your opponent. I don't know how to do it. Grandmasters have messed it up in professional tournaments for a lot of money, so If you want to have these two versus maybe something like, I don't know, this, your rook and your pawn, it's the same 6 points, but it's in a very different context here. It's going to be a lot easier in a simplified endgame, maybe, to use your rook and pawn than it would be to use your knight and bishop, even though they're worth the same points. So how we evaluate material is going to change depending on the context. That is important to keep in mind. And the general rule is how much space are they going to be able to control? How easy is it going to be for us to use those pieces to our advantage? Something else that can impact the material value, how we should evaluate that, is the kind of position we're in the chess game. So a very general distinction that we chess players use is open and closed games. An open game is the kind of game where the pawns in the center, specifically these 4 central pawns that are on the files with the king and the queen, those are going to be exchanged, or at least have the opportunity to be exchanged. So in this kind of situation, we might see just a random opening idea that features quite a lot of exchanges here in the center. And in this position, again, this is just a random sample, nothing to stress about, but you can see that these pawns are all cleared from the board. In an open game, we're going to play a little different than if we were in, let's say, a closed game. If we go back to the beginning and instead of e5, our opponent just plays e6, this might lead into a French-style position. And one of the very common ways that players play against this is they play the move e5. This is an advanced variation. And now you can see this is very different. The pawns are interlocked. They're stuck next to each other. They don't have any options to trade and move out of the way. And if we have a closed type game, that's going to impact how we play, and that's going to impact how we evaluate our pieces. In an open game, where there's no pawns here in the center 2 rows, our bishops become wildly more powerful. If we just look at this position, again, the material is equal. Both sides have 6 pawns. Both sides have 2 minor pieces. Black has 2 knights, white has 2 bishops. And both sides have 2 rooks and a king. So the piece value is equal. But white has a significant advantage. I think Stockfish evaluates this position at about +2, +2.5. And the reason is you look at the scope that these pieces have. So both of these bishops are beautifully lined up, pointing on these long diagonals, each of them controlling a massive amount of space. And these knights are good. I mean, they're in nice central positions, but they can't hold a candle to what the bishops can do in this position. But now let's flip it around, and let's say we're in a more closed type game. This isn't exactly a fully closed game. Obviously, white's missing a pawn here, and it's not locked up. But even something as simple as this, we can see, okay, well, these pawns are locked. This pawn is locked, leaving this bishop trapped. It can't project its influence at the king because it's trapped behind its own pawn. And versus this knight, well, there's not pawns here to challenge, so we have an outposted knight. And if you look at the level of control this knight is exerting on black's king side and queen side, just the whole board, it's just a monster knight here in the center. So the types of pawn structures we have and the position we're in, whether it's an open and closed game, whether we're in the opening or maybe the end game, these are all going to impact how we evaluate the position and how we evaluate our own pieces. So now we're going to move into an actual game. And I'm not going to show you, well, I'll show you the whole game, but we're not going to hyper-analyze the beginning because I'm using this to express a certain point. This game happened in 1868, and it actually featured a player who you might have heard of named Max Lange. He had the white pieces, and some people called him the Mad Max of chess. At least now they call him that, because he played some crazy aggressive ideas. And this game actually features some of that. But we're going to take a look and see if we can find some improvements that he could have made and his opponent could have made. So if we start here, we're actually going to see a King's Gambit. Or sorry, not a King's Gambit, that would be f4. But this kind of delayed maybe King's Gambit, where after some exchanges, black plays aggressively, and white's actually going to sacrifice their knight to get rapid development and piece activity. This is a theoretical opening that it's still okay for white to do. Both sides have to be very careful though. And so again, we see some very flashy, aggressive sacrifices. White's given up a knight, and now is giving up a bishop, all to activate their pieces and to expose the opponent's king. And again, we're not going to analyze these moves too much, but Max Lange does get into a really strong position, and he actually gives his opponent the chance to come back. So in this position, White plays king g2 with the point of activating the rook, and all of White's pieces are really aimed at Black's king, versus Black's pieces are having a lot of trouble getting into the game. So White's pieces are better here, even though they've given up a lot of material. And in this position, Max Lange could have played a really strong winning idea. I'll give the chat a minute to take a look. I won't spend too much time, but if you have any ideas of what Black could do here, feel free to say something. If not, that's okay. But Black to move, or sorry, not Black, White to move. Black just played bishop here to f7, attacking the queen. So my apologies. White to move, and see if you can find an improvement for what Max Lange did in the game. There are a few really strong ideas, but I think only one of them is fully winning in this position. And if you're watching this later, feel free to pause the video and come back and check. Okay, hopefully you've had a little bit of time. What Max Lange played in the game was queen takes h6 check. And his idea is that once the king recaptures, this rook can move wherever it wants to and activate the bishop. And Max is going to try and win the game in this way. Interestingly enough, with the best play, this is actually a draw. The king can withdraw here back to g8, and it's going to be a weird, wacky game, but Black can hold on. However, if you accept and take the queen, now White is winning. The best move in this position is actually rook takes f7 check. With the idea, yeah, Maychess, you got it. I knew what you were talking about. Yeah, rook takes f7 with this idea that, okay, well, if you take with the queen, it's just over. You're giving up your queen. So after knight takes, a very important idea, queen to g4 check. The king is completely locked, so you have to block. And after you do, bishop takes, and there's nothing that can be done. The queen is nearly trapped. You're either going to lose her, or if you try and save the queen, then something like bishop to f6 is going to be more than enough to win. If the king goes to h6, queen g5 is checkmate. And if the king goes to f7, then either bishop h4 or bishop d8 are both checkmate. Again, the importance here is, let's come back, is instead of taking kind of a more calculating approach and finding the surefire victory, Max Lange goes for this really sacrificial, flashy line, you know, giving up the queen. And back in these days, again, this game took place in 1868, there was a little more maybe honor in accepting a sacrifice. If someone sacrifices something, you just have to take it. Now we would want to calculate and evaluate and say, okay, yeah, king g8 is going to be a better move. But let's see how this game developed. So his opponent did take, and now rook g4. This is the best move, keeping the king locked on this side of the board. There's only one move after the discovered check. King to h5, and now again it's White to move, and again Max Lange opts for this very flashy sacrificial idea, but he makes a mistake. So see if, again, take a second, see if you can find the best move in this position for White, and we'll take a look in just a moment. Again, if you're watching at home, not live after this has been put up, feel free to pause the video and take a second to figure it out. A lot to worry about in this position for Black's king. Okay, hopefully you've had enough time. But now let's take a look. The move Max Lange played in the game that is a big mistake is knight to g3 check. This is again a flashy sacrifice, giving up this rook, and there's an idea he has. What happens in the game is after king takes, the only move, rook to f5. And we're locking the king in, and it's going to be mate soon. The improvement is actually to play rook to f5 here. And we're keeping the king locked in. After the take now, h3, king h4, and bishop to f2 checkmate. And it looks like, okay, well, what's the difference? He sacks a rook in one case, sacks a rook in another case. But here's where it matters. So after knight to g3, king takes, rook to f5. There's a very important difference. It's black to move. And in this position, I'll just tell you, Max Lange's opponent just crumbled under this pressure. It was too much. And he played the move h6, which allowed the same idea. h3, king to h4. And now the knight's in the way. So actually, Max Lange sacrifices another piece beautifully. Rook to h5, check. There's only one move. And knight to f5, checkmate. Max sacrifices almost all of his pieces, but still manages to get a beautiful victory. However, he gave his opponent a chance. And here's how this connects to everything. It's black to move. You've seen this continuation. We're about to play check, check, checkmate. Is there any way black can get out of this? What would you play in this position? Trying to survive. Again, take a second and look, get some ideas, and I'll reconnect it to everything we've been talking about so far. Okay, hopefully you've had enough time. The crazy, amazing move that Max Lange's opponent should have played in this position is queen takes e4, sacrificing the queen. This is a crazy counter-sacrifice that probably his opponent wasn't even considering. But here's what happens, is after queen takes e4, it's really quite simple. I mean, what else are you going to do? You're going to take the queen. And now king takes f5, and the king is out of the box. The bishop and knight aren't in a position to force it over into this corner and get a checkmate. And now black's just going to start activating their pieces. And how might you find a move like this? Well, it's all about the material count. Max Lange has been sacrificing his pieces this whole game like a lunatic, and it ends up working in his favor spectacularly. But if he had taken a second and thought, okay, well, rook f5 is a good move, but it's not check, it's not forcing. We give our opponent a move to play. And the reason we can sack a queen is, well, let's look at the material. Right now, white has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 pawns versus black's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, white's up a pawn. But white only has a knight, bishop, and rook. Whereas black has a knight, bishop, and rook, as well as 2 other bishops and a queen. So giving up the queen means that black is still up a bishop and a rook. And that's not even counting the fact that Max is going to get this rook too. After queen takes e4, it's not defended. The knight's going to have to jump and take the queen. And now, this is just horrible. We have a bishop and a knight versus 2 rooks and a bishop. It's a hard move to see, and it's not one you might be consciously thinking about. But if you're in a game where maybe you're winning a lot and, you're losing in the position, your opponent is maybe a move or two away from checkmate, they give you an opportunity. Keep an eye out. Because if you are, this far ahead in material, you can make a move that sacrifices a queen if it saves the game. It might cost you, but in this case, it would have worked really beautifully. So again, the point of material count, we always got to keep this in the back of our mind to help us evaluate. Yes, Max was in a winning position because he could have played the best moves and found a checkmate, and that would have been great. But he missed it, which gave us an opportunity to take a look and really evaluate, okay, well, we have a move. It's not check. Maybe we can get out of this. Let's jump back to our other theme here of piece activity. So when I say a piece is active, I'm talking about it being centrally placed. Now, in this case, it's a bit of a weird one. But like a bishop or a knight, these pieces are very active versus these pieces in the back row are not because they're not in the game yet. So piece activity is really important in evaluating the position. And this is one way that I can show a good example. This is a move, a strategy that you may have encountered if you're a more beginner player, and even if you're not, you may have encountered this at some point in your chess career, where you're playing with the black pieces or even with the white pieces, and your opponent plays very, very aggressively. And they're just going for like some kind of 4-move checkmating idea. They're trying to win all of your pieces, get their queen out, and just make it really easy and make you look silly. There are some important ways that we can counter this type of strategy, and it revolves around piece activity. In this position, for instance, without explaining too in-depth the theory, maybe we'll come back and look at how to deal with open and queen attacks. But right now, just the more basic ideas is we're going to develop our pieces, play really solidly. We're bringing in knight out to defend the center and defend our pawn, which is the immediate threat. If something like bishop to c4, obviously threatening checkmate. A move like g6 pushing the queen away. Queen to f3, reigniting this threat. And now again, we can get some pieces in the game. And all of this time, white is spending a lot of moves, moving their queen back and forth and out. And that's going to allow us to get a little bit of an advantage, because we can start to get some of our pieces out while they're just moving their queen. If they want to be really aggressive, it's going to cost them a lot. After a move like g4, if you don't know what to do, this is really scary. If you just are like, okay, well, maybe I just develop my pieces. They can cause a lot of damage, so you do have to be careful. But if you know the right continuation, let's take some more space. Knight to d4, a really beautiful move, threatening the queen, threatening this beautiful fork. So now the queen has to really try and defend everything. We're attacking this pawn and all of these squares, and look at how much our pieces are controlling. The only really good move here is to go to d1. You could try queen to d3, but now white's going to have even more trouble with piece activity, right? This bishop is going to have a harder time getting out because this pawn can't move. Regardless of what they play, either way, their pieces are hurting. We now have massive control here in the center. And what we're going to do now is try to increase that. A good move here to play is d5. Striking out in the center, and we don't actually care about this pawn. We're more interested in activating our pieces, getting our bishop in the game. So say a move e takes d5 to keep the bishop safe. And now bishop takes g4, and this is looking really, really bad. White has only one piece developed versus our three. And now their one is actually even behind a pawn. It's even worse. All three of our pieces are aimed at white. Really their king and their queen. And it's just very hard to stop. So maybe a move played here could be f3 to try and again prevent taking the queen. And now a really, really brutal move. Knight to e4, with the point that, well, you can't really take anything. If you take my knight, I get your queen. And if you take my bishop, then it's checkmate. So you don't really have any options here. If you don't take anything, I mean, I'm going to do this anyway. The only way to really stop this is probably to play h4. And yeah, I don't even know what white does here. It's just too brutal. And we don't have to spend a lot of time analyzing, but I want to emphasize this point that a queen, right, materially is an extremely powerful piece. 9 points. So much versatility. But if you aren't careful about how you use that, and you allow your opponent to just readily develop their pieces, get some really nice control, some good piece activity, your pieces are going to be worth way more. They're going to be doing more for you than your opponents. So that's another important thing to consider when we're evaluating a position. I would like to quickly go through a really famous game, and this is Morphy's Opera House. I'm sure you've heard of it, and I'm not going to, again, bog down in the analysis of every move. It's been done 100 million times. But what I do want to emphasize is the material count and why the decisions Morphy makes make a lot of sense, even in a materialist fashion. So the game starts, if you're not familiar, with a Philidor Defense. That's indicated by this move d6 here. And white strikes in the center. All of these are theoretical moves, trading some pieces, and now white activates. Again, piece activity is crucial here. The bishop and the queen both pointing at this pawn. Knight to f6, queen to b3, once again, redirecting our aim. Queen to e7, and knight to c3. Instead of being a little material grabby, instead of just taking this pawn here, Morphy decides, you know, I could win a pawn, but I would rather play really solid and get my pieces in the center, give me lots of versatility. His piece activity is his priority here. c6, and bishop g5. And let's just take a pause on this position. If we take a look, material is equal. We've traded a bishop for a knight. We've traded these two center pawns. everything else is the same. We have 7 pawns on each side. We have a bishop and a knight. Or sorry, 2 bishops and a knight versus 2 knights and a bishop. A queen and 2 rooks. It's totally equal. But positionally, this is terrible. Simple game 2. Yeah, this is a terrible opening by black. There are ways to improve what has been done. But the way it is, yeah, this bishop on f8. This knight here is now blocked by this c6 pawn. The rooks are going to be impossible to develop. All of this is, yeah, very, very bad for black. The pieces, even though they have the same amount, they're not active in any way. So black tries to make a bit of a desperate play here, trying to win a little bit of time. And if you have seen this game, you know what's coming. Knight takes b5, really brilliant idea. And we're sacrificing material. We're going to end up winning these 2 pawns for this knight. So we're going to be down a pawn. But Morphy isn't concerned, again, with this just simple material evaluation. We want to look a little bit deeper. After this exchange, white has sacrificed, again, a knight for 2 pawns. But both of black's knights, after this move, the only real move, both of black's knights are pinned. So the bishop is locking them down either to the queen or the king, meaning they effectively can't move and aren't controlling any space. Okay, so they're rendered useless. The bishop is stuck behind the queen. It's not going to get out anytime soon. And black's kingside rook also trapped in the corner behind the bishop. So really, black only has one piece they might be able to use, and that's this rook over here. But even still, like, if you compare that to what white has going on, both of these beautiful active bishops, the queen, there's a versatility in which way we want to castle, kingside or queenside, activating our rooks even farther. And the whole point here is the piece activity ultimately is going to trump just plain material. Again, all of this is context dependent. So let's see what happens next. White castles kingside to improve the pressure on this pinned knight on d7. Rook to d8 defending, and once again we have a sacrifice. Rook takes on d7. The material here is less important because Morphy is recognizing, yeah, I'm giving up this rook. But if we really want to count material pretty accurately, we can just discount these 2 pieces. These bishop and rook, they're not in the game at all. It's tempting to almost even discount the rook and the knight here because once again, they're both pinned. So really, the only piece black has that's doing anything productive is this queen. And it is trying desperately to hold everything together. It's trying to keep the pawns, the rook, the knight, everything safe, the king ultimately, and it's just kind of failing. So understanding that Morphy is calculating material and their value, but he's evaluating not just on the piece being on the board, but it being in a position where it can do something meaningful. This game ends in pretty spectacular fashion. After queen to e6, Morphy trades, and then finds a beautiful checkmating idea. And we look, and he sacrificed all of his pieces save this bishop and rook. But unlike the Max Lange game, none of what Morphy did was really flashy, maybe except for this ending. All of it served a purpose. He was very aware of what his material sacrifices were doing and how they would lead him to this ultimate goal, rather than making some little mistakes and allowing the opponent the opportunity to breathe. Okay. And we're going to move on here to one more example that I want to look at with you. This is a really fascinating game that I've done some different looking at and studying. And this game was between Rene Martner and Bobby Fischer. We'll start out, Bobby had the black pieces, by the way. So we're going to be playing as the opponent of Bobby Fischer. Hope you're prepared for that. We have d4, knight to f6, c4, and g6. This is indicating a King's Indian style defense. Bishop to g7. And we're not going to focus, again, too much on the opening here. Now, this does look a little good for white because now, yeah, you could argue, well, look, black's pieces are all pretty silly here in the back. I've got my knight, I've got my space. This is actually an okay opening for black, mostly because they're planning to counter-strike in the center and take advantage of maybe white's overextending. But so don't worry too much about that. But again, we get through this kind of opening sequence. And like I said, black is striking back in the center, hoping to get now some really nice piece development. And we have some trades and exchanges. But let's get to this position here. Okay. So a lot's been traded. A lot has happened, and we have some complexity here. Black's king is safe and castled. This knight is a little silly maybe right now, but it has some versatility in terms of where it comes to develop. Black has the option to continue pushing forward with maybe f5 and e4, maybe continuing to threaten to trade. And then also they have this queen on this nice line. White's pieces look decent. Maybe this queen is a little silly here on b1, locking the rook in. But we have some nice knights and bishops out in the center. We would want to definitely develop this bishop and castle. But in this type of position, how would you evaluate what's going on? Again, some of that would come through what I just said. Materially, we can take a look, and I don't think this is quite equal. I think it's close. We might be up a pawn. 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, no, pawns are equal. So yeah, it looks totally equal. So materially, again, we can say, okay, so there's no obvious immediate advantage. But now let's look at what the pieces are doing. Once again, we said, let's first go back to what I talked about. We're kind of in a middle game here. We're not quite in an end game yet. So the fact that these pieces are all active is definitely a plus. This knight is maybe a little bit of a hindrance, as is this bishop. And we can also look at whether this is an open or closed game. This is definitely, maybe it's not fully open. We still have a pawn here on e5, but it's much more open than closed, right? We've exchanged at least 3 of these center pawns. So what does that tell us? So one, that tells us maybe we should value our bishops a little more. And if we actually look, we can see that, yeah, maybe Bobby's knights aren't quite as active as they could be. Maybe not as active as ours, but his bishops are doing a lot of work. These pieces are really making some big threats. When this knight moves, there's going to be an attack on our pawn here with the bishop and the queen. When this pawn either pushes forward or is traded, the bishop's going to have just a beautiful diagonal. And you compare that to our bishops, well, this one's kind of blocked. We don't really have a great place for it. We just need to get it in the game to castle. And this bishop is okay. Eventually, we would love to trade it for this dark squared bishop here and infiltrate this castle. But as it is right now, it also doesn't really have a lot of great places to go. So that's one thing we can look at. We can also talk about an open, we just talked about open and closed game. Something else that's important in the open and closed game is to recognize in a closed game, you don't actually have to castle as early. And if we actually, I'm just going to quickly jump back. But if we're in like a kind of closed structure, all these pawns are locked up, it's going to be actually pretty hard to expose the king to an attack. You don't have to stress about it as much. Versus in a more open game, and I'll come back to the game we're looking at right now, this king is pretty exposed, especially once this pawn is traded. And both of these files open up for the rooks, for the queen, the bishops can come in. It's actually going to be really dangerous for us really soon. So that should be a primary concern. So we need to get our king safe. For that reason, one of the not great moves in this position is to take this pawn. As tempting as it looks, right? We just lost a pawn. We would love to just take it back, make it really simple, not have to worry about any discovered attacks. But the problem is, if we take this pawn, whether it's with our pawn or with our knight maybe, really regardless of what takes, there's going to be an exchange. And no matter what happens, all of this is opened up. And our king is now extremely exposed. So again, if we look at taking with the pawn, I've drawn some arrows to try and help illustrate, but you can see this knight is going to develop into the game, and the rooks are going to slide in and attack the king. The bishop is now beautifully activated on this diagonal. The knight's hitting everything. The bishop and the queen are working together. And this whole position is going to open up really, really fast, and our king is too exposed. And the same thing happens if we take with the knight. It's going to be identical. In this case, we have the queen and the bishop working together to attack our pawn here in the corner and maybe look at the rook. We have a pin we have to worry about on our bishop that's not defended. And again, the king is too exposed. Even if we play a move that doesn't trade, maybe we play something like knight to e4, trying to control some valuable space. This doesn't look great because black can now trade, and we're going to have to run away. And even if we win that rook, this is still much better for black because, again, our king is too exposed. Our knights have good center control, but it's too open. The bishops are going to dominate. This rook and queen are going to dominate. So all of that we have to consider, even if we're up material. So that's why in this game, Martner played the best move. He actually played f5, which does a few things. One, it's lined up with our queen. So it's maybe trying to get our queen, which is on a bit of a silly square, more active. Additionally, we're preventing this pawn from being easily traded. Now it can still be pushed, but we'll worry about that when we come to it. But we are making an immediate threat. And now Bobby's turn to move, and maybe we're expecting him to just take this pawn. We would not mind that at all, right? We can trade the knight for the bishop, and now this pawn is still here, and there's some discovered threats. I would still say this is a little better for black, but because this pawn is in the way, it's going to be harder to attack our king, so we have a little more time to get our bishop and our king castled. Plus, we've also weakened our opponent's castle. Without this g-pawn, it's going to be a little easier for us to launch an attack as well. So it's a double-edged sword. But instead of just taking this pawn, and again, you can take it with the pawn or bishop, it wouldn't matter. The position's going to end up the same. Bobby plays a really interesting move. Maybe not the best, but it's going to make us think. He plays the move e4. And now we got a lot of questions to ask. It's a very complex position. How do we evaluate it? Let's survey this scene. Our knight is attacked, their bishop is attacked. So we have an instant option. Maybe we can trade some pieces. Do we want to trade pieces? Well, let's take a look. Say we take this bishop. What's going to happen? I think this is going to be a little problematic. This is actually what happens in the game. After they take our knight, g takes f3, and again, just look at our pieces. Our rook, our queen, our bishop, and our kingside rook all are just sitting here on the back rank. Our king is totally exposed. As soon as this pawn is dealt with and black can open up with the rooks, this is going to be really, really hard to survive. This is what was played in the game. Maybe better would have been to consider a move like knight takes c4. So now instead of taking this pawn, maybe we're taking here. I don't like this as much because now we have to deal with this potential pin. Maybe this is a little better than, well, this is certainly better than if we had taken the pawn. But this is still maybe not quite the best move because we are, again, now having to worry about an attack on our king. Finally, let's take a second here and see if anyone can figure out the best move. So we've looked at taking this pawn with the knight, and we've looked at taking this bishop with our pawn. And in both cases, it's a little lackluster. I still think black is better. But there is a move that actually gives us some fighting chances here. And it might be a little hard to see, but the move that's actually really, really good is queen takes e4. And the reason is, even though we're maybe giving up this pawn one day, and maybe we're giving up this one, it's all about activity. Our queen is now much more active here in the center, and is going to be able to play a vital role in both offense and defense. Maybe she'll be able to buy us a little time to get castled, maybe even queenside if we really have to, if it's that desperate. But we're going to need to get our king out of harm's way soon. And we can look at a possible continuation, right? Their bishop is still under attack, so maybe pawn takes f5. If they just take with a bishop, then we're happy to trade, right? A knight is going to be worse than a bishop in this really open game where there's all this space. And our queen is going to have some nice impact on the king side. And if the pawn takes, I would recommend we not take back. But instead, we just get our queen to a nice square. Maybe we attack their queen. I would be happy to make a trade like this when the board is so open. My king is very exposed. You could also maybe consider going to h4 to keep up some activity and some pressure. But if we were in this position to take the pawn with our knight, this could lead us into some trouble, not because of bishop takes, that would transpose to the nice variation, but because of knight to f6. And now they're activating their pieces again. Their knight's out of the way of the rooks, so the rooks are going to slide over. The knight's attacking the queen, and their queen is still ready and able to come in. A lot of things we got to worry about. One possible continuation could be queen to c2, bishop takes, queen takes, rook f to e8. And now how do we deal with all of these threats? Our bishop is pinned, and queen to a5 is a potential threat we have to worry about one day. Not immediately because our queen is covering it, but we have to be aware of it. So king to f2, I mean, we need to keep our bishop in the game. And now there's a really devastating move. Rook takes e3, king takes, and Bobby would be very happy to sacrifice material because he's activating his pieces, especially because our king is right here out in the open. It is very compelling to give up a rook for a bishop down that exchange in order to launch this massive attack. Running away isn't really going to do us any good because black's resources are too strong. You can see there's checkmating threats already, and we don't have to continue much farther in this line. But those are the things we need to be worried about when we're evaluating this position. And you don't have to think in terms of that whole line, but just think in that general trend. What is our biggest problem in this position? We don't want the position to open up. So if we trade, it's going to open up. Their rooks, their bishops, their knight, their queen, all of these pieces are going to come alive and attack our king, who is just sitting here lowly in the center. Unfortunately, that's what did happen in the game. F takes e6. Pawn takes f3, g takes, and again, just look at these pieces, how poorly developed they are. Even though we are winning in material, we are losing because just their pieces are doing a lot more. They're doing more work. In this position, Bobby plays the move f5 with the threat here of moving forward and forking our knight and our bishop. So we need to do something about that. f4 was the move played in the game. Seems reasonable. And now knight to f6. And Bobby Fischer is really striking at all of our weaknesses. This bishop is now just doing very little. The knight's going to come in and cause a big problem, control some really important squares, and do it relatively uncontested. So bishop e2, preparing to castle, but more importantly, covering this square so the knight can't easily jump in and provoke us. And now rook f to e8. And you can already see we're not going to be able to defend this pawn, and this line is too important. It is okay for Bobby to be down a little bit of material because his activity is much better. King to f2. You could try castling here, might be a little better, but regardless, it's not going to be enough. Rook takes e6, rook to e1, rook a to e8, doubling with a threat to take. Bishop to f3. And now in this position, it is black to move. I will actually flip the board here because no longer do we have to try and stress about fighting Bobby Fischer. We've moved past that point. Now it's our turn to think with Bobby Fischer and see if we can figure out a way to win. Evaluating this position, what might we look at? What might come to our minds to try and take advantage here? Again, we're thinking about material. And again, I think we might be... Actually, no, material looks even. It's just a bishop versus a knight. So that's okay. But if you look at our activity, that's the important part. Is our knights are controlling the center very well, making a lot of threatening squares. The queen's on a decent square. The bishop's controlling a little bit of space, so it's going to be hard to infiltrate immediately, but we have some nice diagonals to work with here. Our bishop, as soon as this knight moves, is going to open up and attack in the corner. And obviously our doubled rooks is a major advantage, putting a lot of pressure here on the e-file. So trying to find the best move, again, take a little bit of time, but don't stress if you can't find it. It's a bit of a harder one. Yeah, I don't know how to pronounce your name, Karibo something, but that king is not in a great space, I agree. And we're actually going to see why. In this position, black to move, and we have a really beautiful sacrifice. Rook takes e3. And we're down in exchange, rook for a bishop. Rook takes e3, rook takes e3, king takes e3. And Bobby has gotten the king out in the center, so we've definitely achieved that. But now how do we finish this attack? There's a really beautiful tactical strike. So if you have any ideas, go ahead and take a look, see if you can find what's the tactical strike here. How can we finish this game in a really beautiful fashion? We're down some material, but this queen and this rook are virtually out of the game. So we don't have to worry about them if we can find a way to end it here. Any ideas from the chat or our live audience? How can we finish this game as black? What? Oh, that's okay. Okay, I have a few people who in the chat, J, Robert, GR, and Ferdiset, who both have the idea. Queen takes f4. Really just stunning sacrifice. The purpose here isn't to try and find all the best tactics, but to think about what we've achieved. If we look at this, the king can run away, certainly. Anywhere he goes that's not defending a piece, we're just going to win this bishop. But even if he goes back here, I mean, I guess we're just fine. Something like this, maybe just check, and that looks pretty good. So the obvious move is going to be to take. And the problem here, does anyone see it? Yeah, Krubo, you saw it too. Yeah, bishop to h6, checkmates. Controlling all of the key squares, and the king is just fully trapped. So what is the purpose of that? Let's go back to the very beginning here. And the purpose of all of this is to think, how do we evaluate these positions? Maybe you do some memorizing of opening theory, and that's great. But that's only going to take you so far. Until you understand why the moves you're playing are what you're playing, what their purposes is, what their point is, it's hard to move forward. If we look at this position already black has an advantage. The bishops are beautifully lined up. This knight, while it's sitting here on the back, it's still in a versatile square. Once these pawns are exchanged, it's probably going to jump back to f6, maybe after f5 is pushed. And we also have the option to jump in either of these squares at some point as well. And if you compare that to white's pieces, they have these two pieces which aren't really doing much. The knight's controlling a few nice squares maybe. But this knight would be much better if there were maybe a kingside attack going on, which just isn't really happening and doesn't have the potential, at least right now, because we gotta worry about our king first. And so again, if you just look at how to evaluate the position, it starts with material. You have to start there. Is there a name for this opening? This is a King's Indian. I don't know what this e5, there is a line here. I think it's a side line. I think the main move in this position is probably just knight f3. There's different ways to play. But to get back to my closing point, is if we think about all of this, the way you evaluate a position, you have to start at the very basics. How many pieces do I have? How many does my opponent have? And then you move to, why are those pieces valued the way they are? If we go to, again, one of our positions like this closed game, this knight is worth more than this bishop. Our general rule says they're both worth 3, but this bishop is stuck. Its scope is much more limited. Versus this knight is outposted really beautifully. It's controlling a lot of important central squares, and there's really nothing that can challenge it. So we have to take those things into consideration. 1, what pieces do we have? And 2, how are they being used? If you're trying to make a plan, you want to look at the pieces you have and think, okay, what's a move I could play that would improve some of my pieces? Or maybe what pieces is my opponent using that are really strong? Can I trade them off for something that I'm not using? This is a good way to start to think about improving your chess. So I really hope that this was valuable for you. Again, it was a pretty basic intro to the beginner breakdown series, but by surveying the scene, by evaluating these positions, by counting our material, and then really thinking about what it's worth and how we can improve it, you're going to be on a really good way to start improving your chess. So again, my name's Alex. It's been a pleasure, and I hope to see you again next week.